Welcome to Radical Engagement's current VAR blog as we continue to slog through our long march through JudgeSabo's Read on Authority by Engels. All right, now we're going to get to some more substantive debate stuff. We've gotten through the term, we've seen the problems of the argument. I agree with much of JudgeSabo's critique of Engels. I see some of the weaknesses in some of the anarchist definitions, but Engels doesn't really address the weaknesses I see. Attempts to steelman Engels actually pull arguments that aren't there from the text and are often self-contradictory. All true. But let's get into the main two issues, which is the site of equivocation. All right. All right. Socialist future, anarchists combine action and the authority of machines. All right. JudgeSabo, let's go. Engels asked us to adopt an entirely point of view of the anti-authoritarians, but this he means that, as a thought experiment, we may assume that socialist revolution has been successful, that the capitalists have been dethroned, and that, in accordance with what the anarchists propose, the instruments of labor are now collectively owned by the workers who regularly occupy and use them, are what council communists and even some Bourdieuists propose, i.e. the mines to the miners, the farms to the farmers, the factories to the factory workers, etc. Okay, I will say this, that's a syndicalist definition. I actually do think workers have to be in charge of more than just their sector. All right. And that's why I'm not a syndicalist. I'm sympathetic to syndicalism. I think that, firms as firm government should basically be run cooperatively. Although by itself, it does not fix the problem that I see. Now, that's a critique of syndicalist anarchism and actually some other kinds of syndicalism too, fascist syndicalism, national syndicalism, etc. It's a critique of co-ops as a transitional method to communism, although I think co-ops could be part of an overall panoply of things used to transition to communism, or to just empower workers, etc. All right. So we have my difference right there. But again, that's not Engels' argument. That's actually kind of Panacook and Bourdieu's argument against the syndicalist, which is why I get mad when people argue that cancelism is somehow just a retrojection back to syndicalism, because it's not. All right. Or when people like Matt McNair call everybody they don't like Bakuninist, because it's false. All right. Anyway, trust me, some McNairites have called me a Bakuninist many times. And my Bakuninist anarchist friends would probably snicker at that, because they get annoyed with me just as much as the McNairists do. All right, anyway, back to this. To the extent Engels has accurately represented anarchist thought, especially given his focus on Bakunin, as he was part of the collectivist movement, in contrast to the Proudhonian mutualists, who were also anarchists. We haven't talked much about mutualism. A lot of the better arguments that Marx and Engels land on anarchism are landed against Proudhonism, not against Bakuninism. There are good arguments against Bakuninism, actually. Its Whiggishness, its tendency towards terrorism, etc. Bakunin not making smart decisions on endorsing people who fell into barracks communism, but they are, that's in addition to his personal flaws. But that's not, Marxists don't land that often. Right. And some of the Bakunin critique of Marx is like almost Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy level. But there's also points that Bakunin lands that aren't wrong. So, you gotta make it what you will. All right. The crux of Engels' argument is that combined action, i.e. tasks that would require coordinated and simultaneous actions of multiple people, require someone or some group to do the coordinating, such as making schedules. Asterisk. While I have my critiques of cybernetics, basic cybernetic theory, and the Cordones in Chile, if they'd actually done something about the military, proved that you can do this and let people be relatively autonomous. Anyway, without this, certain tasks are impossible by the very nature of the activity, such as operating a factory. That's why you need planning. There is such a thing as, stateless planning. Capitalists do it all the fucking time. All right. In socialism, this would need to be settled through means like majority vote or assigning a task of coordinating to some delegate. Yeah, I don't want a majority vote on every single production decision. Oh my God, I can't imagine anything worse. All right. Anarchists generally do not dispute this reasoning, and in fact, they have made this point themselves. For example, in James Guillemet's The Idea of Social Organization in 1876, he argues in certain lines of production, especially ones that need to use complicated and expensive machinery, will require collective labor. Yeah, we're not getting rid of the division of labor, folks. We're just making it not a caste in which you are born or relegated to by credentialing or whatever. All right. Quote, it is evident that a collective labor is imposed by the very nature of the work, and since the tools of labor are no longer simple individual tools but machines, it must be tended by many workers. The machines must be collectively owned, or not owned at all. All right. The exact same reasoning Engels has used to show the necessity of combined action at the start of one authority. Guillemet also agrees that the administration will be needed in these lines of production, which will also require certain delegates to be assigned the task of coordinating people so they can work in concert. Long quote from Guillemet. So long as they conform to the principle of justice and equity, or inequality. Principle of justice is vague. The administration of a community elected by all of its members should be entrusted either to an individual or to a commission of many members. It will even be possible to separate the different administrative functions, such as assigning functions to a special commission. The hours of labor will be fixed not by a general law applicable to an entire country. Yeah, but it's not. You can't do that. Making your sectionary decisions and planning too broad like that is a mistake. Ask the Italians. But by the decision of the community itself. But as the community contracts relations with all other agricultural workers of the region, an agreement covering uniform worker hours will probably be reached. Yeah, we don't do that now. We don't need to work as much as we do now. He recognized that the same observances regarding management of hours of labor, remuneration, and distributive process will also apply to industrial labor. None of these points seem to be areas of disagreement between Engels and the anarchists. The real question then is, will we need delegates for administrative tasks? But it was not, will we need delegates for administrative tasks, but rather, does the existence of administrative functions contradict anarchist principles? If certain tasks are like making a schedule involve authority according to a standard anarchist definition, then anarchists cannot condemn authority while supporting these kinds of activities that make these tasks necessary. We do already have a strong indication that what anarchist response would be like, since in the process of analyzing the anarchist definition of authority, we have seen several distinctions made between authority and administration. Engels partly referenced this in On Authority when the most rabid anti-authoritarians distinguish between granting authority and commission entrusted. To avoid the charge of simply changing the name of things, we should further analyze what material basis is making themselves distinct. Further, Engels has argued that not only delegates, but the complex machinery itself would have the authority in socialism. Yeah, that doesn't make sense because the complex machinery itself has no will. That actually damages Engels' definition. Engels' argument seems to inherently connect this authority to that of the delegate. The delegate's just going to be the tool of the tool, which is not true. This is this weird tendency that Marxists sometimes have towards technocracy while also critiquing technocracy. Yeah, we'll get in there. That's a dialectical move that never sublates. All right. It's enough to make me an Althusserian almost. All right. To avoid the charge of simply changing the name of things, we should further analyze what material basis has made the things themselves distinct. Oh, I already read that. Furthermore, Engels has argued, or I read that too. The complex machinery would itself have authority in socialism. Engels' argument seems to inherently connect this authority to that of a delegate. Presumably, if the authority of delegate is proven, then so is the machine's authority. I mean, that presumption is actually not sound. But, because you could argue that the delegate is not actually following the machine's authority accurately and thus is a bad delegate. So this is the first piece of logical argumentation that I think doesn't actually totally flow. Anyway, at the beginning, we see how some Marxist scholars, such as Robert C. Tucker, noted that Engels appears to be contradicting Marx when he asserts that the machinery of industry is inherently despotic in relation to workers. Yeah, I think he's contradicting Marx in a big way, actually, in a way that like invalidates parts of Capital Volume 2 and 3. All right. I believe this is not only inconsistent, not only with Marx, but also with Engels himself. Yep. Both are rather emphatic that the feature of socialism is that the workers are no longer dominated by their own means of production as they are within capitalism. Yep. They make the point over and over again. Even late Engels does. This is a deviation because he's mad and trying to win an argument poorly. This is really what I think. All right. Anarchist combined action. Engels argued that some activities like running a factory require combined action and therefore require organization and therefore requires authority because of the need to settle certain administrative tasks like scheduling. As was briefly covered before, some anarchists did reject what they called organization. We call those people anti-organizational anarchists, are in denial about the basic state of human nature. And by human nature, I mean the fact that we're social. That's all I'm glancing there. Don't get into the human nature arguments with me. All right. However, these are anti-organizationalists seem to use the word differently from what Engels means here. They did not reject combined action and advocated for building a network of smaller affinity groups who would work together and coordinate their activities by free agreement. Communization theory. Anyway, what they rejected was larger and more formal organizations like federations. Most anarchists, however, would appear to have been organizationalists. They also believe in free agreement, but saw no contradiction between this and building larger federations. In that case, anarchists believed in combined action. Yeah, they kind of see things as like nested dolls of confederating going out. Engels appears to have more organizationalist anarchists in mind. He takes for granted that anarchists intend to have factories and systems of delegates within anarchy. Yeah, at least the ones that aren't Perdonites. All right. His argument is not asserting that anarchists reject organization, but that they do not and therefore contradict themselves because a certain authority, no matter how delegated, exists whenever there is combined action. I mean, so much of this is a semantic debate, but nonetheless, if Engels' argument is successful, it should also apply to the anarcho-organizationalists and even to more modern anarcho-primitivists who also wish to abolish factories, are like your frontal cortex. Don't at me. That's a John Saracen argument that's real. He made this clear in his letter to Theodore Cuno. Engels believed his argument would apply even to a society of two people. We can break down the response to Engels' arguments here into two basic questions. The primary question must be answered is whether combined action by free agreement really involves no authority according to the standard anarchist definition, and if it does not, then Engels' argument is demolished. He has misunderstood and misrepresented their stance. Secondly, we can address how anarchists, especially organizational anarchists, expect the anarchy to look like and the principles at play that would allow for large-scale combined action like a factory. I mean, some of these factory questions are not as relevant anymore. Capitalism has inverted this stuff back on itself. But back to the text. Because of this focus, I will not give too much attention here to anti-organizationalist positions. This is partly because I am personally in favor of organization and more familiar with that anarchist position, but also because it is a more relevant form of anarchism that Engels is addressing within On Authority. Yeah, the anti-organizationalists were like really some individualists in America, and that was pretty much it. I do not intend to imply that the anti-organizationalist position does not merit serious study and consideration. To make up for this lack of attention, if any readers want to explore anti-organizationalist anarchism in this period more, I recommend checking out Luigi Galani's The End of Anarchism, 1925, as well as Shirley Baker's newly published work on early anarchist history, means and ends, anarchism in Europe and the United States from 2023, which I have been citing throughout this paper, as well as several other of her essays. I need to ask Zoe Baker on a show. People have been asking me to talk to Zoe Baker for a long time. Maybe I should do it. All right. A relationship based on free agreement is meant to be without authority. As we've seen, authoritarian relationships are marked by being, in the fundamental sense, involuntary. They have been coercively imposed by one party claiming a right to the command of another party, establishing a kind of relation of domination or exploitation. This coercive power, as thus established, may not be physical, but also economic and even intellectual. The essence of free agreement is voluntary association and expression of that person's individual liberty. Yeah, and even Engels said that freedom of association was legitimate. Without any kind of which makes faction bans dumb, but nonetheless, that's a digression. Without any kind of coercive imposition, two or more people may decide to interact and work together to do something and continue working together as long as their agreement continues. Against Engels' claim, authority is not necessarily for society of two people. They may need to make some accommodations for the other and make some compromises as they come to agreement, but those compromises can be reached voluntarily rather than through coercive methods. If two people want to play a game of tennis, they may need to negotiate what time they will meet, but this does not need to be settled by one of them pulling a gun on the other. Yeah, duh. All right. What is also important to keep in mind, the anarchists have a holistic notion of freedom. Anarchists recognize authority as coming out only in direct forms of physical violence, but also in indirect forms of control of key resources to force others into submission. Also a Marxist argument, something we share. In modern capitalism, this later form of authority is often styled as voluntary. Anarchist free agreement should be understood not only in contrast to the authoritarian notions of technocratic and absolute state directing the society from the center, but also from so-called liberalism and its play out voluntary contracts when the means of production have been strictly controlled by the capitalist class and by state enforcement by guns. That's the last part is Varn adding it because it's implied, but we should be stated. Marx shared this critique of so-called voluntary labor under capitalism. Marx presents the involuntary relation underlining this in Capital. Quote, long quote from Marx. Capitalist production, therefore, is itself of itself reproduces the separation between labor power and the means of labor. It therefore reproduces and perpetuates the conditions for exploiting the laborer. It incessantly forces him to sell his labor power in order to live and enables the capitalist to purchase that labor power in order to enrich himself. It is by no mere accident that capitalists and laborer confront each other in the market as buyer and seller. It is this process itself that incessantly hurls back the laborer on the market as a vendor of his labor power, and that incessantly converts his own product into a means in which another man can purchase him. In reality, the labor belongs to the capital. Before being sold himself to capital, his economic bondage is both bought about and concealed by his periodic sale of himself, by the charge of his masters, and by the oscillation in the market price of labor power. Anarchists have agreed with much of Marx's analysis of cannibalism. Some anarchists sometimes. Graeber didn't, for example. Saracen doesn't. Wayne Price does. Ron Tabor doesn't, maybe. Who else? Kropotkin does. Anna Goldman does. Chomsky does. Anyway. And so much that Chomsky is still an anarchist, I guess. We saw anarchists emphasize the inherent connection between freedom and equality, including the opposition to class divisions and the system of property is built upon. Anarchists therefore advocated for real freedom, which required collective ownership of the means of production. Anarchists viewed freedom and equality found in the system of free agreements and collective ownership as the basis of a real society. It forms a system of solidarity, recognizing and expanding our own freedom through others. Anarchists do not see their opposition to authority as an opposition to the socialization or combined action. Asterisk. Collectivist, anarcho-communist, and certain other anarchists don't. Can't generalize about anarchists here. I know you know that, JudgeSabo, but I'm just going to add that back in. On the contrary, what they saw as freedom as their true foundation is a contrast to the false basis of authority. This is clearly expressed in Emma Goldman's What Anarchism, What It Really Stands For, long quote from Emma Goldman. In destroying the government and its statutory laws, anarchism proposes to rescue the self-respect and independence of the individual from all forms of restraint and invasion by authority. Only in freedom can man grow to his full stature. Only in freedom can he learn to think and move and give the very best in him. I think that's true, although there are some socialists who disagree with me because they don't trust people. Only in which case they don't know why they're socialists, but whatever. Only in freedom will he realize the true force of social bonds, which knit him together, and only which are the true foundation of his normal social life. Yeah, I agree with that. Because these are voluntary social relations, they are formed precisely because the various parties involved see it as within their own interest and actively pursue it. Thus, rather than authority, giving their association a much more durable basis, whereas Engels only sees the limitations that come without having to accommodate the existence of others, at least when dealing with anarchists, they counter by emphasizing the very real expansion of our capacities through free social relations. This connects how we saw anarchism viewed the freedom of each dependent on the freedom of all. The domination and exploitation of anyone, even when not aimed directly at us, not only threatens our own freedom, but actively limits it since it harms the system of free association that expands our own liberty. Hence, Bakunin's conclusion that man is really free to the extent that his freedom, fully acknowledged and mirrored by the free consent of the fellow men, finds the confirmation and expansion in their liberty. With this, we have seen sufficiently answered our first question and demolished Engel's central argument against anarchism. Thanks to a more accurate understanding of the anarchist notion of authority, we are also able to recognize some forms of social interaction that do not coercively impose relations of domination and exploitation. Instead, a system built upon free agreement and collective ownership upon freedom and equity finds a durable basis in solidarity. Yes, but also all these notions need to be fleshed out more. Anyway, anarchists are not so naive as to think that people would never have conflicting desires. Again, most anarchists aren't so naive. Most never say so X doesn't believe and Y because the internet exists and we can find someone saying the opposite. All right. In fact, a world would seem to conflict with the very idea of freedom, but they did believe that these disagreements could be resolved with authority in the relevant sense of the term by use of free agreements. Having established the real possibility of anarchist combined action, now we may analyze some anarchists imagine this might take shape at a large scale in a more formal federations or system of delegates. Anarchists emphasize the freedom found in anarchy and the pluralism of organizational forms we should expect from it according to people's circumstances and particular drives. Actually, I like this pluralism a lot more than I like Marxist attempts to not be pluralistic, even though in practice they end up being pluralistic anyway, but they do so by entering liberal pluralistic institutions as front, which is just gross, but nonetheless. All right. Anarchists, therefore, when describing things at a larger scale, tended to emphasize certain general principles expected to be common in these organizations, like opposition to authority. As Malatesta described in his anarchist program, anarchists propose, quote, the organization of social life by means of free association, federation of producers and consumers, created and modified according to the wishes of their members, guided by science and experience, free from any kind of imposition which does not spring from natural needs, to which everyone, convinced by the feeling of their overriding necessity, voluntarily submits. So natural needs are going to shift depending on development. All right. The ideal world organized along anarchist principles has been expressed by Bakunin before in his Revolutionary Catechism, not a text I love, as we discussed before, in 1866, but expressed a bit more detail in the National Catechism in 1866. There he argued that any countries after the revolution would need to recognize certain principles, the first of which was these. Yeah. There's a way to read Bakunin's National Catechism as national anarchism, and we have to remember that Bakunin was actually allied with left nationalists in Italy. Anyway, okay, number one. It is absolutely necessary for any country wishing to join the free federations of people to replace its centralized bureaucratic and military organizations by a federalist organization based only on the absolute liberty and autonomy of regions, provinces, communes, associations, and individuals. Nested liberty here. This federation will operate with elected functionaries directly responsible to the people. It will not be a nation organized from top down, but are from the center to the circumference. Yeah, no core periphery shit. Rejecting the principle of imposed and regimented unity, it will only be directed from the bottom up, from the circumference to the center, and according to the principle of free federation. Its free individuals will form voluntary associations, its associations will form voluntary autonomous communes, its communes will form voluntary autonomous provinces, its provinces will form regions, and the regions will freely federate into countries which, in turn, will sooner or later create a universal world federation, of which everyone is subject. Haha. Although everyone being subject to a voluntary federation is interesting. All right. 2. Recognition of absolute right of every individual, company, association, and nation to succeed from any body with which it is affiliated. That part is the part that's a little bit iffy. Not going to lie. All right. And in principle, I agree with this. In practice, I don't know how possible it is. All right, we have a conception here of free agreement, which provides the basis of a system built from the bottom up by free people themselves. These associations confederate into larger organizations following principles that respect the individual liberty on which a system is building. This is done by maintaining autonomy within these organizations where power is not given to any elected functionaries, but the right to dissociate from these organizations, meaning that the federation depends on continued voluntary consent. Just as an individual might disassociate from a group, groups may disassociate from the individual if they are judged unreliable, antagonistic to the group's purposes. This is why there'll be many different types of groups, because everyone's going to need one. This is also why Ursula K. Le Guin just lets the reactionaries have their own place and leaves them alone, and the dispossessed and her imagining of a future anarchist society. All right. For example, Peter Kropotkin responds in The Conquest of Bread to the claim of how authority is necessary to avoid loafers who refuse to work. Let us take a group of volunteers combining for some particular enterprise. Having at first succeeded at heart, they all work with a will, save one of the associates who is frequently absent from his post. They must, in his account, dissolve the group, elect a president to impose fines, must stay on his account, dissolve the group, elect a president to impose fines, or distribute markers for works done as is customary in the academy. Yeah, you don't need grades, folks. It is evident that neither the one nor the other will be done, but someday the comrade who imperils the enterprise will be told, friend, we should like to work with you, but as often as absent you are from your post and you do your work negligently, we must part. Go and find other comrades with who will put up with your indifference. This is a way so natural that it is practiced everywhere nowadays in all industries and competition with all possible systems of fines, docking of wages, supervision, etc. A workman may enter a factory at the appointed time, but if he does his work badly, he hinders his comrades by his laziness or other defects, and they quarrel with him on that account. There is an end to it, and he is compelled to leave the workshop. You can get fired in anarchism, but only because you pissed off everybody. Fair, I guess. The unity achieved by this is meant to be much stronger precisely because people are able to recognize that it is in with their own interest. In a world based on solidarity, there is a much greater harmony of interest thanks to the abolition of class distinctions and property, as well as the impossibility of exploitation, which this is much easier to achieve. Thus, the unity of purpose of people within these organizations would allow people to move more easily to a unanimous consensus on a course of action. Asterisk. I don't think so. All right, this is the first time I'm going to really stand up. I don't think that this would lead to unanimous consensus. I think it would lead to much less acrimonious and zero-sum antagonism and much less coercion, although kicking someone out is still coercive. You sometimes have to do it, but you'd have to do it. It does reduce this, but it doesn't make it go away. Now, again, not relevant to the Engels thing, but I think this is where I'm a little bit like, whenever people talk about consensus and not just majority accounting, I get a little bit like, I don't know, man. I've never seen consensus in my life. Not real consensus anyway, not amongst a group of more than 20. All right. At least after a certain period of discourse. At an organizational level, it is still operating entirely in conformity with the will of its membership. Yeah, but not all of its membership. It's not going to be consensus-based. It's going to be like majority-based, probably. It would almost have to be. Anarchism did not necessarily expect this to always be the case, and they recognize there may be times where consensus may not be reached. Thank you, because it's going to be not reached a lot. Malatesta expressed this idea in this way in a short dialogue between peasants in 1884. In practice, one would do what one could. Everything is done within reach of humanity, and when this is impossible, one should vote and do what the majority wanted. Yeah, that's what I would say. In practice, we aim for consensus, but in practice, majority rules gonna have to still fly. So, else put the decision in the hands of a third party, which would act as an arbitrator, respecting the invalidity of the principles of equity and justice, of which society is based. So, you're gonna still need third party arbitration. Might still need something like law, but ever shifting law that one consents to. Yeah, I mean, you can see how this is a lot to promise, but even Marxism eventually promises something like this, so it's something we have to take seriously. In some ways, the Marxist answer is like, we'll get there, but later is, and we're not going to tell you what it is at all, is a lot bigger. All right. People should not utilize their right to disassociate, dissociate unresolvable disagreements, which could be set about other methods, which people would recognize and voluntarily comply with. This would include utilizing majority vote or handing over the matter to an arbitrator. Yeah, not all anarchists would accept that, but that is what Malatesta is arguing for. Presumably, it could also involve any number of other measures too, like flipping a coin, depending on the issue at hand. Yeah, if you need fate to decide. Malatesta expected this kind of situation to be rare. I think it would be less rare than he thinks, but I don't think it would be everything. And typically applies to less important matters, though, as experience teaches people the best way of doing something. It would also apply to new matters where experience doesn't guide you. Yeah. Anyway. So, yeah, this stuff I'm a little bit less... I agree with Malatesta, but I would have to say some of the anarchist things about consensus seem totally idealistic to me. And even the concessions to majority vote seem to place it as being rare. I don't think it would be rare. I don't think it would be as contested as now, because if you're not fighting for survival and getting ahead all the time, you have different things to focus on. And I don't think competition will go away, actually, or antagonism will go away in a socialist or anarchist society. I just don't. But I think it would greatly reduce and become much less zero sum. There's more parties of mediation and less enforcement of an individual will that is in no one's interest, or only the interest of the ruler, etc. Even when utilizing a vote, anarchists maintain their opposition to democratic government. They made it clear that opposition to rule by the majority, or even if they believe that these systems were always in practice reduced to rule by some elite minority. Yeah, I think that's true. That's why I don't trust representation. I do think rule by the majority vote would work for a lot of things, like recalling delegates, etc., controlling the bureaucrats, for example. We see this, for example, in Malatesta's comments about organizational platform of the libertarian communists. Quote, "It is well known that anarchists do not accept majority government democracy any more than they accept government by the few, aristocracy, oligarchy, or dictatorship by one class or party, nor that of one individual, autocracy, monarchy, or political or personal dictatorship. Thousands of times anarchists have criticized so-called majority governments by which they practice always leads to the domination of a small minority." I mean, Aristotle even saw that. He just thought you fought that with kings. All right. The minority vote retain their right to persuade the majority to their side, and if they are unsuccessful, to disassociate if they consider the matter important enough. That's only if nothing is of life or death stakes can that be addressed that way. Life or death stake things do need to work out. I do think that this would reduce zero-sum competition if that's life or death stakes being more common, but you still have to deal with it. All right. If they decide to retain in the group, however, in the spirit of solidarity, it's expected that it would be in good practice for a minority to go along with the opinion of the majority. I do think that discipline is well suited. If you voluntarily join an organization, you should be subject to its discipline. This is why I'm very careful about what organizations I join, even when I support their stuff, is because even Marx and Engels said sometimes you had to stand apart of organizations, so not to speak for them, because organizations should be represented by the majority well. All right. except when they got pissed off. All right. If they decide to remain in the group, however, it is in spirit of solidarity. It's expected being a practice for majority go along with the opinion of the majority, as long as this agreement is voluntary rather than compelled. Voluntary compelled gets a little bit complicated here. I'm not going to lie. All right. Certainly, anarchists recognize, this is a long quote, and I believe this is from Malatesta. Certainly, anarchists recognize that where life is lived in common, it is often necessary for the minority to come to accept the opinion of the majority. When there is an obvious need or usefulness in doing something, and to do it requires an agreement of all, the few who should feel the need to adopt the wishes of the many, and usually in the interest of living peacefully together under the conditions of equality, it is necessary for everyone to be motivated by a spirit of concord, tolerance, and compromise. But such adaptation, on one hand, by one group must, on the other, be reciprocal, voluntary, and must stem from the awareness and need and goodwill to prevent the running of social affairs from being paralyzed by obstinacy or by majority tyranny. It cannot, that's me adding that, it cannot be imposed as a principle and solitary norm. Yep, I agree with that. This is an idea which perhaps in daily life in general is difficult to attain in entirety, but is in fact that in every human grouping, anarchy is that much nearer to where agreement between the majority and minority is free and spontaneous and exempt from any imposition that does not derive from the natural order of things. Good examples of anarchist decision-making and how to vote can be found in Zoe Baker's Anarchism and Democracy, including several examples of anarchist organizations that use consensus decision-making or use majority votes, where they can be found each to be appropriate. And I think the consensus stuff from anarchists ends up being a problem. Most anarchists in practice go to majority vote a lot, and they should just own up to that. All right. What they don't want is oligarchical representation of an elected elite that just happens to have an advantage in national elections, which is what we have in most parliamentary systems and definitely in the American congressional system. All right. But Engel's argued on authority that workers may not be able to resort to majority votes. Some tasks will need to be taken on by certain individual committees delegated with their own particular task. Anarchists appear to agree here, as we saw with Guillemet Bakunin's reference to elected functionaries, the Yar Federation's proposal of a correspondence and statistical bureau, or even Malatesta's suggestions of arbitration are previous distinctions between government and free administration. Delegates in an anarchist system are meant to act as informed go-betweens who can speak and negotiate on behalf of the group of people, but crucially have no power to impose any decision they come to. Peter Kropotkin elaborated this in the Conquest of the Bread from the example of railways. Okay, let's see what the long Kropotkin quote is. Quote, railways were constructed piece by piece, the pieces were joined together, and the hundred driver companies to whom the pieces belong came to an understanding concerning the arrival and departure of their trains and the running of carriages on their rails from all countries without unloading merchandise as it passes from one network to another. This was all done by free agreement, by exchange of letters and proposals, by congresses at which delegates met to discuss certain special subjects. But we're not to make laws after the Congress delegates return to their companies, not with a law, but with a draft of a contract to be accepted or rejected. But that contract was bound by law, Kropotkin, so still a little bit iffy. There were certain obstinate men who would not be convinced, but the common interest compelled them to agree without invoking the help of armies against the refractory members. Usually. Asterisk, usually. There were some armies in the American West, guys. All right. They were definitely Pinkerton shooting at things. All right. He expanded on the nature of this system and of delegation previously in the work of the Webel, 1885. The question of true delegation versus representation can be best understood. And I actually like Kropotkin's work on delegation versus representation because I detest representation. Can be better understood if one imagines 100 or 200 men who meet each day in their work and share common concerns, who know each other thoroughly, who having discussed every aspect of the question that concerns them and having reached a decision. Then they choose someone and send them to reach an argument with other delegates of the same kind on a particular issue. On an occasion, the choice is made with full knowledge of the question, and everyone knows what is expected of his delegate. The delegate is not authorized to do more than explain to other delegates the considerations that have led his colleagues to their conclusion. Not being able to impose anything, He will seek an understanding and will return with a simple proposition, which his mandatories can accept or refuse. This is what happens when true delegation comes into being. When communes send their delegates to other communes, they need no other kind of mandate. This is how it has been done already by meteorologists and statistics and statisticians in their international congresses. Yeah, the scientific community does work this way, or at least did. It doesn't so much anymore. By the delegates of railway and post administrations meeting from several countries. The cooperation between countries is actually a good model for this because there is no such thing as international imposition of law. International law is an anarchy, and policy realists see this as scary, but it is what it is. And because all delegate subjects between countries, such as the United Nations, are voluntary. But this also shows a problem with it because, for example, the United States helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it's not subject to the Hague Court, which enforces it. And in fact, it goes so far as to say that if anyone tried to enforce the International Court of Justice on them, that they would actually invoke a military response. So there's that. But in general, this is how international arbitration works, with the exception of the fact that stronger powers bully weaker ones. All right. Okay, back to JudgeSabo. Delegates, in contrast, is a system of representative government and politics, work as a way to facilitate correspondence and communication between field assemblies. They like the authority to command or forbid. To prevent this from turning into an authoritarian system, anarchists propose a number of measures, not only including decision-making power remaining in the hands of people who elected these functionaries, being given instead a strict mandate, but also that the position is only held for a fixed term and regularly rotate, allowing many people to learn how to do the task themselves through practice. I think this is important, and I like the fact that anarchists emphasize this, and I don't like the fact that Marxists and social democrats don't. That tasking people through practice skills them, and that's one of the things that we have to aim to do. And making sure any delegate to be immediately recalled by the membership for, going rogue. Various anarchist organizations have attempted to put these principles into practice, but for economic functions like running a factory, as well as for the purposes of defense with anarchist militias. Many syndicalist labor unions have often been built upon anarchist principles with strong anarchist influences, such as the CGT in France, the CNT in Spain, the FUD in Germany, and the IWW in the USA. Prominent anarchist militias have also been included the Mankiewicz Black Army during the Russian Revolution, the CNT's Defense Committee used during the Spanish Civil War. It's a problem that they don't often win, as Mao argued against his comrades when the Chinese Communist Party was insisting on militia forces in the 1920s. All right. A federation built on these principles would conform with Bakunin's idea of a federation that which is controlled from the bottom up, from the circumference to the center. With this foundation, we can see how anarchists might propose to operate a factory with a system of free agreements and non-authoritarian delegation. In other words, socialism is marked by self-management of the workers themselves. Yep. Rather than by class rule over the workers. Yep. None of this is to say that anarchists demand that people rely on these types of structures either for all decision-making. Anarchists heavily emphasize the role of direct action and individual initiative as a way of advancing the emancipation of the working classes. Yes, although direct action can devolve into terrorism really easily. And that was a classical Leninist critique of anarchists, at least in Russia. All right. It's not in... it's actually not in anything on authority, though. So, yeah. All right. And in relation to these types of organizations that would rob the workers of what would be unethical to anarchist methods and goals, associations, federations should be instead viewed as tools the workers may utilize in the process rather than institutions, which is using them. Well, institutions are tools, but they're more than tools, and this is something that I think anarchists need to work out a little more. At least classical anarchists didn't really address it sufficiently for me. Neither did Marxists, actually. Marxists kind of underestimate the power of institutions that go on their own logic. Even though they see it in capital, they don't often see it in bureaucratic institutions. Anyway, Engels argued that anarchists, by accepting a system of delegates and administrations, have introduced authority into their organization. Their only method of denying this, he imagined, was merely to refer to it by a different name without any real material distinction from other forms of authority. We have seen here that this is false. Well, mostly false. I think there's some points that are vaguer than JudgeSabo is letting on, but I will mostly grant JudgeSabo the argument. Where anarchists did believe in moral formal systems with delegation, anarchists distinguish between these functions from authority, not arbitrarily, but through an understanding of voluntary association for agreement, which was held to be and was materially distinguished from authority. And there we go. This is why council communists are not truly anarchists, is because they would consider the decisions of federations binding to those in them. But that workers' management and that everyone in society would be in some way a worker and thus transcend the class distinction is a given in this form. All right. We have a few more episodes in this, maybe only 2 more. Maybe even 1 more if I do a big epic one. All right, but we're going to end tonight. I hope you have a great day. And we are about through this text. It's going to be a while before I do a text this long again.